Hello and welcome to today's episode of the Bible Your Biography Podcast. I am your host. My name is Lynna, and today we begin where the Bible itself begins. Perhaps not in the way that we've been taught to read it. When most people open to Genesis, they believe they are reading the history of the universe. They expect the opening chapters to explain how the physical world came into existence. Yet, if Scripture is your biography, then Genesis is not describing the beginning of the world. It is describing the beginning of awareness within you. It is describing the first identity. The Bible is revealing the unfolding of consciousness. When we begin to read Scripture psychologically instead of historically, every word begins to carry an entirely different meaning. Nothing is random. Every name, every number, every sequence, and every symbol becomes part of an unfolding pattern that describes our own journey from spiritual sleep to spiritual awakening. Genesis opens with a phrase most of us have heard countless times. In the beginning. We usually imagine a point somewhere billions of years ago. But perhaps the beginning is not the beginning of time. Perhaps it is the beginning of awareness itself, the awareness of the first identity, being Adam. Humanity, or man, in a deep state of sleep. So every awakening begins with a beginning. Every realization begins with a beginning. Every new state begins with a beginning. Scripture is not pointing backward through history, it is pointing inward towards consciousness. Even the Hebrew letters begin to suggest something far deeper than a simple historical event. The word beginning starts with the Hebrew letter bet, whose primary meaning is house. Throughout Scripture, the house represents consciousness itself. It is a dwelling place where awareness lives. Jesus later says, "In my Father's house are many mansions." Neville Goddard explains that these mansions are not locations after death, but states of consciousness. The beginning, therefore, starts within the house of awareness itself. The letter Gamal follows. Gamal carries the idea of nurturing, maturing, and carrying something until it reaches completion. And the reason we bypassed the letter E in beginning is because the vowels do not actually contribute towards the word as a whole within the Hebrew alphabet. So again, Gamal carries the idea of nurturing, maturing, and carrying something until it reaches completion. Consciousness does not awaken all at once. Every realization grows. Every state matures. Every insight develops until it becomes natural. The journey of awakening is never forced. It unfolds. And consciousness itself is remembered. The letter Nun appears as well, twice in the word beginning. The letter N. So Nun carries several fascinating symbolic meanings, including kingship, fish, miracle, hidden life, and even ideas associated with concealment and apparent loss. The fish has long represented life beneath the surface. Something exists before it becomes visible. Perhaps that is exactly how consciousness develops. Before awakening becomes visible in experience, it already exists beneath the surface of awareness. Long before we consciously recognize ourselves, something within us is already growing toward realization. Even the word beginning quietly contains the entire process of awakening. A house, growth, hidden life, maturity, then another movement of growth. Genesis continues by separating light from darkness and introduces something that seems incredibly simple. The evening and the morning were the first day. Most of us pass over that sentence without giving it much thought. But why does the day begin with evening instead of morning? Perhaps because every transformation begins in what we cannot yet see. Evening is often associated with Eve, whose name means the living one, the source of life. Before the light of consciousness, understanding, or before the light of conscious understanding appears, life itself is already present. Creation begins invisibly. Then comes morning. Morning is not simply sunrise. The morning represents understanding, meaning, recognition, the dawn of awareness. Every spiritual awakening follows this pattern. First comes the unseen movement within consciousness. Then comes understanding. Only afterward does experience reflect what has already happened internally. Perhaps this is why Scripture repeatedly tells us that faith is the evidence of things not seen. Creation always begins invisibly. The pattern continues through the days of Genesis. Many have noticed that Adam's third son, Seth, becomes the line through which the biblical story continues. From Seth, there are 6 generations before Noah appears as the 7th. That pattern immediately echoes the 6 days of creation, followed by the 7th day of rest. Could these genealogies be describing the movement of consciousness rather than biological history? The number 7 appears throughout Scripture whenever something reaches completion. The 7th day, the 7th trumpet, the 7th seal, 7 churches, 7 spirits. 7 is a movement from activity into fulfillment. Then we meet Noah. The name Noah means rest, not inactivity, but completion. The work has already been finished. And just as Genesis declares that God rested on the 7th day because his work was complete, consciousness eventually reaches a state where striving gives way to knowing. Neville Goddard often reminded us that creation is finished. If creation is already complete, then perhaps rest is not something we earn. Perhaps rest is what naturally appears when we recognize that nothing remains to be created, only entered. Noah has 3 sons. The ark itself contains 3 levels. Again, Scripture repeats the number 3. Throughout the Bible, 3 frequently represents different levels of consciousness. Some see these as the conscious, the subconscious, and deeper spiritual awareness. Others see them as body, soul, and spirit. Regardless of the terminology, the pattern remains remarkably consistent. Transformation always involves multiple dimensions of awareness coming into harmony. The ark itself becomes a beautiful symbol. It is not simply a wooden boat surviving a flood. It becomes a structure of consciousness carrying life safely through periods of transformation. The flood is not merely water. Throughout Scripture, water often symbolizes states of mind, emotions, or collective consciousness. The ark carries awareness through changing psychological conditions until a new world appears. Then Scripture introduces Abraham. His name means father of a multitude. Spiritually, this may describe the creative power of consciousness itself. One assumption gives birth to countless experiences. One identity produces an entire world. From a single state come innumerable expressions. Consciousness is always multiplying itself. Then comes David. David means beloved. David is the symbol of awakened humanity. What an extraordinary progression. First awakening, then rest, then creative expansion, then beloved identity and awakened humanity. Before awakening reaches its fullest expression, consciousness discovers its own value. It recognizes itself as beloved. not because of achievement, not because of performance, but because of what it already is. Finally, the pattern culminates in Jesus. The name Jesus means God saves. Jesus is really the personification of the power and the wisdom of God. Neville repeatedly explained that Jesus represents the awakened imagination, the power and wisdom of God revealed within the individual, not merely a historical figure to admire, but the fulfillment of consciousness awakening to itself. When viewed together, these names almost describe an entire spiritual journey. Adam represents humanity asleep within identification with the outer world. Noah represents rest. Abraham represents creative expansion. David represents beloved identity. And Jesus represents complete realization. Perhaps these are not simply 5 individuals. Perhaps they are 5 great movements within consciousness itself. As we continue exploring Scripture together, you'll notice that the Bible rarely explains itself directly. Instead, it leaves patterns, echoes, symbols, numbers, names, genealogies, stories that appear separate yet quietly reveal the same truth from different perspectives. The Bible speaks the language of consciousness. Once we begin seeing these patterns, Scripture becomes less about memorizing information and more about recognizing ourselves. The story begins to feel strangely familiar because it is. It is your story, your awareness, your unfolding, your awakening. Perhaps that is why Genesis is called the beginning. Not because it records the beginning of the universe, but because every time awareness recognizes itself, the beginning happens again. So that is all I have for today's episode on the beginning. Thank you for joining me for this episode of the Bible Your Biography Podcast. And if this episode gave you a new way of seeing Scripture, I invite you to subscribe and share it with someone who is ready to discover that the Bible is far more than history. It is a story of consciousness, and ultimately, it is the story of you, the pattern of Scripture unfolding within you, the Bible, your biography. I will see you in the next episode. Bye now.